Missy. All right, so we are recording now, so I will call this work session of the Port of Olympia Commission. I will call this officially in session. It's 3:30 on March 18th, 2024. And being I am otherwise located, I would like to ask Vice President Vasavada to preside over the meeting.
Gladly, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, with that, the meeting has been called to order and we will start with approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve the agenda.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Nobody's opposed. The agenda is approved. I will just take a point of personal privilege and note that this is our first meeting where we are being staffed by our new executive director, Alex Smith. Amazing, and I see that Camille has an additional information to add.
Yes. So for the record, Commissioner, you should mention that Commissioner Tong is not in attendance today as part of your proceedings.
Thank you. I will note for the record that Commissioner Sarah Tong is not in attendance today, but we do have a quorum and we'll be moving forward. Welcome, Alex. I assume there'll be a moment for some kind of notes that we didn't put on, address that we didn't put on the agenda, perhaps we can invite later. But yeah, we should do it that way. Okay, let's go to our briefing by Fish and Wildlife. I want to thank the constituents who brought this forward to us, your incredible expertise. We have with us Michelle Thierry, District Biology from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, who is an expert in one of our local threatened and endangered species. Thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome.
Please take the.
Do you want to add it? No?
Well,
Okay.
no, we're just really pleased to have Michelle here. She's not going to talk about our HCP process or the incidental take permit. That's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife thing. So she's going to present from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's perspective on prairies and prairie species. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the commission inviting me to give a presentation. Many years ago, I presented to the Port Commission on prairie species. I want to say 25 years ago. So it's been a long time coming. So this is exciting. So I am district biologist for Pierce, Thurston, and North Central Lewis County. So within that geographic footprint, I have management responsibility for all both game and non-game species recovery, lots of things within that footprint. I've been with the agency for 33 years, so I've been around. And we were just talking about when Rudy Rudolph and I both started this journey together when species were just listed and we weren't doing anything for these particular species. So Rudy and I have kind of walked that path together all these years. So today's presentation is going to be a focus on prairies and prairie species that rely on them. And in particular, I'm going to spend a little more time on Olympia Airport and the surrounding areas of Olympia Airport. That was a request. That's the key interest here. We do have a lot to present, so I'm just going to run through the presentation and then maybe you can ask some, we'll have some time at the end for you to ask some questions or you can jot your questions down. And if I don't have an answer for them, I'll try to get you an answer. Yes, I have to point. It's not arrow. Huh? Arrow. This is this. Work on Friday. Want to just advance for her? Okay, I'll just say advance. Advance. All right, so a little about the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Our mission is to preserve, protect, perpetuate fish and wildlife and the ecosystems that they rely on while providing sustainable fish and wildlife recreational and commercial opportunities. WDFW operates as the state's principal agency for species protection and conservation under mandate defined as Title 77 under the RCW of Washington. Our department activities are also subject to the provisions of Title 220 of the Washington Administrative Code. We have a 9-member governor-appointed commission who each serve a 6-year term. We also have a director that provides our strategic direction and our operational oversight. We work in partnership with the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Agency, so people get that confused. We are the state Fish and Wildlife Agency, and then we have the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Agency, and we work together. There are species and habitats that are listed only within the state and not at the federal level, and not so much always vice versa. Usually if they're listed across their range in the United States, usually they're also listed within Washington State. And we also work closely with our other state agency, environmental agencies like Department of Natural Resources, Department of Ecology. We act as consultants to the local jurisdictions, like all the cities and counties. So they come to us for our expertise, and we consider ourselves the consultants to them. They have the final word. Advance. So let's get our minds here thinking a little bit about prairies, especially for anybody who's new to the prairie ecosystem. So native prairie is among the most endangered ecological communities in North America. What many people, especially so many people that are new to Washington State, don't realize is that the South Puget Sound was once covered in prairies. We had very extensive prairies all across the South Puget Sound. And those were intermixed with oak savannas. And the extent of that is what you see all here in the tan colored. The yellow is, or the green is what is extant, what is still remains today. These prairies were created by the retreating Vashon Glacier 15,000 years ago. And as it retreated, the glacier retreated, it left behind this really droughty, really gravelly soil that doesn't grow much in terms of timber or shrub, but it grows forbs and wildflowers. Before the arrival of Europeans, these glacial outwash prairies still existed on about 180,000 acres with small grass and oak savannas dispersed between them. The Native Americans who lived here, they benefited from the prairie and the species, and they maintained those prairies because of that, camas, deer, elk, and they maintained them by burning them periodically over the last 4,000 years. And it's really an important distinction. A lot of people say, oh, the Native Americans created the prairies. No, they did not create the prairies. The prairies have always been here. They maintained the prairies in order to produce foods and materials that they gathered. So they were really important in terms of maintaining those, but those prairie soils have always existed here, as I said, because of retreating glaciers. Advance. So prairie vegetation is dominated by a variety of grasses and wildflowers with very, very few trees. How many here have actually gone out to one of our really pristine prairies, like on Prairie Appreciation Day? Okay, I've got a couple hands. I invite you for Prairie Appreciation Day, when the camas is in bloom, it looks like this. You'll be so proud to live in an area that has prairie because it's absolutely stunning. And it shows itself for such a short amount of time. They don't bloom all year round. So they display showy, slow-growing forbs and flowers as seen here on some of our local prairies. The trees are limited due to the dry and gravelly soil, except for the Oregon white oak, which actually thrives in this kind of soil. And oaks depend on some fire, so that also produces their mast and helps them survive here. And because of the sheer amount of Douglas fir that we have broadcast across our landscape in all of our long history of doing forestry, a lot of that seed is now encroaching. It's growing and encroaching on what was originally prairie. And so you'll see these prairie soils that traditionally didn't grow timber that you have conifer trees popping up in. That's not a natural function. It's basically because we spread so much Doug fir seed through forestry practices. And so where that happens on some of our prairies that we are maintaining and restoring, we actually take those conifers out because they overshade the prairie plants and they kind of disrupt the entire ecosystem there. Advance. So as Europeans arrived in Western Washington, they obviously began to convert native prairie to farming, housing, and industrial uses. On the left in green, we see the extent prairie that was here. And on the right, the orange is what remains. Only about 8% of our original prairie actually remains in Washington. About 2 to 3% of that only is what we would consider pristine or high quality prairie. So we've lost most of our prairie. Next. So here's a prairie soils map for Pierce County. The tan and the brown is the extent of the Nisqually and Spanaway Sandy Loam series. In other words, what we traditionally consider as prairie. The green hatching represents that portion of the prairie that still remains based on our most recent surveys that were done in the 90s. Advance. And here's the extent of that in Thurston County, which historically had more extensive prairies and is famous for other structures like the Mima Mounds. Unfortunately, some of the heaviest development in the state is occurring on these really flat prairie lands. Again, the green is what we have left in Thurston County. Prairies are valuable from a habitat perspective for their own sake, but additionally, several species of wildlife have evolved with prairies and so are absolutely dependent on these prairies. Or at least some component of the prairies. For example, pocket gophers depend on the prairie soils. They can actually tolerate some different habitat on top as long as it's slow growing, but some component of that prairie they depend on in the sense of gophers at soils. So most of these species can't readily adapt to any other habitat type that don't have those same components. The result has been that as these prairies have declined and disappeared, so do the species that depend on them. Many of these species are now both state and federally listed or endangered, listed as threatened or endangered because of that close association they have with this prairie and that prairie loss. Next. There are hundreds of species that use prairies around the world, many of them that use prairies here in Washington. Listed here are some that we consider species of greatest conservation need. That is an actual term that's used in our agency and agencies across the United States, at which we write a management plan for these species and we get funding for that. There are species here on this list that we consider most in need of immediate conservation action. Those with asterisks here are ones that are state or federally listed because of critically declining numbers. Almost half of them on the list are in that situation. So now let's take a look at a few focal species that currently or historically occupied bush prairie, the site of what is now the Olympia Airport. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on two of our main species, Mazama pocket gopher and street-torn lark, because that's what influences sort of the airport and the port operations mostly, those two species. Next. So here's our Mazama pocket gopher. Sometimes called the Western pocket gopher. It's a really small, it's about 5.5 inches burrowing rodent that's found only in Western Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. The individuals can vary in color from yellowish hazel to black, but they're typically this light kind of reddish brown. Pocket gophers are sometimes confused with moles because they're seldom seen above ground, and like moles, they push up dirt. But we can, when you have experience with them, you can differentiate the mole mounds from the pocket gopher mounds. There's a lot of things that characterize them as differently. Also, moles are insectivorous. They eat insects, whereas they don't have the chisel-like teeth that rodents have, like pocket gophers have. So that differentiates them. Pocket gophers get their names because they have a lining inside their cheek, which they actually stuff food in, i.e. a pocket. So that's the pocket gopher name. There are 8 recognized subspecies of Mazama pocket gopher, and they're listed up here with both their federal and their state listing and where they're located. These are those in Western Washington, Mazama pocket gopher for Western Washington. There's a 9th subspecies that you'll sometimes hear about, the brush prairie, not to be confused with our bush prairie, but there's the brush prairie pocket gopher of Clark County. It was once described in some literature, but we've never been able to prove that as a separate subspecies. So dismiss that one if you hear about. There's actually 8 subspecies. Of those 8 species, 2 are already extinct. And all 6 of the remaining subspecies pocket gophers were listed as threatened by the state, by WDFW in 2006. 4 of those subspecies were then later federally listed as threatened by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2014, including the Olympic pocket gopher that occupies the Olympia Airport. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, we conducted a very elaborate study in 2016 based on hair samples for pocket gophers that we collected across their range in the South Sound to look at the genetic differentiation of these different species across their distribution. And what we found is that the results of that were generally consistent with these 6 remaining subspecies, lending support that these 6 subspecies is actually the only ones that we have, that they are genetically different as subspecies and that there are no more than these 6 subspecies to the best of our research knowledge. Next. So there is a pocket gopher that's found in Eastern Washington, which people sometimes say, oh, you got tons of pocket gophers. That's a different subspecies. That's called the Northern pocket gopher. It's the most widely distributed pocket gopher in North America, and it's the Thalmamys talpoides. So that's a completely different subspecies. The Mazama pocket gophers Like I said before, they're in Western Washington, Western Oregon, and a portion of Northern California. That's the extent of their range. Over half of the historically known populations of the Mazama pocket gophers have disappeared in Washington. And like I said, there's 2 of the originally described subspecies are now extinct. That would be the Louisii and the Tacomanensis. The Tacomanensis used to be up in the Tacoma Point Defiance area. We no longer have those. Most surviving populations are small, less than 100, and they appear to be very isolated from each other. Next. So gophers in South Sound historically extended from southwestern corner of Thurston County, northeast to Point Defiance and Tacoma, and as far east as Puyallup. Those populations were not contiguous across there. They were found in isolated populations, and that's how they kind of exist today. In the South Sound today, Mazama pocket gophers are distributed across roughly 9 or more general areas where remnants of those historic prairies still exist, and those would be those blue. The blue areas are where they currently exist today, and there's the listing of the 9 sort of general areas where we still find them today. I've outlined here in red the historic bush prairie, which contains obviously the Olympia Airport. It's important to remember that this area was historically prairie before European settlement, as evidenced by the brown soils underneath it, which was prairie soils. I've sometimes heard people refer to the creation of the airport and the maintenance of that habitat is what attracted these species to the airport. And as I mentioned, it's actually the opposite. That the Olympia Airport was much more extensive as a prairie, and all those species used to exist on them as long before we got here. And it's the maintenance of it as still an open grassland type habitat, which has allowed pocket gophers and these other street-torn larks to remain occupying these sites versus the area surrounding that's been largely developed and fragmented and converted to other habitats. So just an important distinction there in terms of that, the longevity of these species. Next. So here we see the remaining locations of gophers in the South Sound in blue, and they're grouped together as subspecies in purple. And then you can kind of see that broken black line that encircles them, which is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that area and those species that are considered federally listed. The 6 subspecies I haven't put on this map, which is the Olympic subspecies, which is different than the Olympia. There's the Olympic subspecies, which is found up in the Olympic Mountains. To understand why U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed only 4 of the 6 subspecies, that would be a long conversation, and I would just direct you to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website. They've got some good documents on their work that they did to narrow it down to just the 4 species. But WDFW does recognize 6 subspecies remaining in the state. Next. So to lend support to the current knowledge about distribution of pocket gophers, in 2012, our agency conducted an extensive survey. We had 784 plots in Thurston, Mason, Pierce, Lewis, and Grays Harbor County. We added to that about 150 supplemental site visits in these counties, as well as visiting all historical sites in Wahkiakum and Clark counties. We were testing our hypotheses that gophers are actually restricted to traditional prairie soils and locations. And to test that hypotheses, we included in that study a lot of plots and other types of habitat and other types of non-prairie soils. And, there was this idea at the times that there's a lot of pocket gophers out there, you're just not finding them. And they're not really that tied to prairies. They can be found elsewhere. So that was the purpose behind this study in 2012. We added on to that data from 2014 to 2017 collected by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Thurston County, who surveyed about 1,239 sites, development sites for the presence of gophers. Here we see the results of all that combined work, and the purple are the locations where Mazama pocket gophers were found. Obviously, the white dots there are the ones where they were not found in that study. With very rare exceptions, the results overwhelmingly confirmed that Mazama pocket gophers are distributed where we believe they were, which is historic prairie containing remnant prairie soils. It also confirmed that gophers are limited, isolated, and declining. 4 areas in particular support the largest populations of Mazamas today and are critical to their recovery: the Olympia Airport, Shelton Airport, Scatter Creek Wildlife Area, and various areas on Joint Base Lewis-McChord. The gopher population on the Olympia Airport and the surrounding bush prairie is very noticeable. Here is that big purple patch. Luckily, all 4 of these core areas are publicly owned. So that's a good thing. Next. So our agency conducts pocket gopher surveys using a standardized survey protocol that was approved and developed with our research division that relies on recording fresh mounds while walking along defined transects. Using this protocol, our research leads can then produce a density estimate for each site and estimate the approximate population size for the population of gophers on that site. Unfortunately, they're still crunching those numbers from the surveys that we did last year, so I don't have an Olympia Airport estimate, but I will get that to you as soon as I do, and maybe Ms. Sean can remind me if I don't. We've done these surveys now at all of our largest prairie sites, or most of our largest prairie sites, and this year we're going to start taking on many of our smaller prairie sites, public and privately owned. Here we see the results for surveys that were done at Olympia Airport, and I appreciate Warren and Rudy and all the folks at the Olympia Airport for working with us and letting us get on and continue to do these surveys that we need to do. Just amazing staff to work with. The red and the blue dots are here are our start and stop locations for each of our transects, and the yellow dots are the gopher locations as verified by only the freshest gopher mounds. So in this study, we're not recording every mound, we're recording only the freshest mound, knowing that right underneath there, and by fresh, I mean within 24 to 48 hours, meaning there's a gopher underneath there, and the study is designed so that it takes into account the full range of each gopher. That's the whole purpose of this. That's why through our research that we've done at the end of this, we can actually turn it into a population estimate. As you can see, gophers are densely distributed across most of the airport. We find some of the densest concentrations of gophers at the airport, which is what makes this location so very important for gophers. Gophers are less dense on the south approach zone and on the east side leased lands. Next. So Mazamas were state and federally listed due to their significant population decline, their range reduction, subpopulation isolation, ongoing loss and conversion of habitat, weakness of regulatory mechanisms to protect them at the time of their listing, native and non-native predators, disease, climate change, and stochastic or uncontrollable events. And I'll just refer you to these various documents that we have on both our website and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website if you want to read more about pocket gophers and kind of go in depth on that. Whole nother presentation. Next. But I will cover really quick just the highlights of what the plans hold. So the WDFW state recovery plan for Mazama pocket gophers, we have finalized one. And it delineates 7 recovery areas in Thurston, Pierce, and Mason counties where we would need to create 1 to 3 reserves in each recovery area in order to delist the species. The reserve types would consist of large contiguous patches, AKA reserve cores, or aggregations of 2 or more patches, AKA reserve complexes that would have these various satellites in order to protect pocket gopher habitat. A core reserve complex, either one of those 2 scenarios has to contain greater than 250 acres of more preferred gopher soils in a protected status to be qualified as meeting one of the recovery objectives. And it needs to be able to support greater than or equal to 1,000 gophers. That's what qualifies. So we need 1 to 3 of those in each recovery area. The Olympia Airport is an example of a core site. It already would meet that requirement. Next. So the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery plan relies on establishing a certain number of protected gopher reserves as well in each of its 4 designated subspecies recovery areas. And you can see how they laid that out, the criterion up in that table on the top.
I can't read.
I know, well, I know. I was saying these TVs don't lend themselves well to a presentation with data. So, but we're gonna share the slides.
Okay.
I don't know if you have the slides, you probably
Would have been.
Okay, yeah. But Missy has my slide presentation, so yeah, I apologize for that. But the recovery areas outlined here on the map, hopefully you can at least see the map. The yelm is the blue is the yelm subspecies, and the orange are the 3 other subspecies. Like the state recovery plan, the recovery areas will be comprised of reserve cores and or complexes made up of small satellites. So that's kind of that depiction down below from the federal plan. Priority reserve areas are purple on this map. So those are what they consider their priority areas. And then one of those would be the Olympia Airport, Olympia pocket gopher. And the federally designated critical habitat is bright yellow. And I won't go into details of that, but needless to say, when the feds list a species, they also list federal critical habitat. They define on that landscape where habitat that's critical to the species is, and it's kind of locked in at that point. And that's identified here in yellow. The Olympia Airport is both a federal priority area and a designated critical habitat. Next. So now I'll move on to another species, amazing prairie obligate species, the streaked-horned lark, beautiful bird, an amazing song. I wish I would have brought the song here to play. Maybe on your way home, you can pull it up. It's a gorgeous sound. The male of this small ground nesting bird has dark tufts of feathers on the back of its head, giving it this horned look. You can kind of see one sticking up, and they really stick up when they aren't alert. And that's where they get their name, the streaked horned lark. It has a brown back and neck, yellowish underparts, and a yellow eyebrow stripe and yellow on the throat. And the male is usually very bright. The older males are very bright, brighter than this picture here. This one's kind of washed out, but they're really quite bright. Females and the young are much more cryptic. They blend really well into that grasslands, where they nest. Horned larks prefer sparsely vegetated prairies and agricultural land with very short vegetation and lots of bare ground. These birds forage for seeds and insects. And so streaked-horned larks are more focused on the structure of a prairie than the actual specific type of vegetation, right? It's that really low-growing vegetation where they can hide, but also put their head up and kind of see just above the grasses and lots of bare ground. So they're structurally driven, and that structure is found on prairies and grasslands, but not so much anywhere else. Next. Click two more times. There you go. Okay, so historically, streaked-horned larks range from British Columbia south to the Rogue River Valley in southern Oregon, which is that tan color underneath all of this, or tannish white. The streaked-horned lark's current distribution is across these 4 yellow polygons, but even within those polygons, they've only been confirmed breeding within, hopefully you can see some orange spots underneath that, but it's these orange locations where we continue to find them breeding. So they've had a significant range in population reduction over the years. An accurate population estimate for larks is really difficult. It's easier here, but their range that they occupy down in Oregon is mostly agricultural fields. And these are huge agricultural fields. And again, larks being tied to structure, as these fields grow up, the larks will kind of go next to a field that has that low vegetation, and then they'll sort of move around a bit more. So it's a little bit more difficult to get the population estimate for Oregon as it is in Washington. But regardless, our very best estimate is that there is 1,500 individual birds remaining across some 50 individual sites across their entire range. So that's about all that we have left for streaked-horned larks, about 1,500 birds, not a lot. Next. There are other subspecies of horned larks that reside elsewhere in Washington, but it's the streaked-horned lark, which is the Strigata subspecies that's found only in a few locations in the South Puget Sound, the outer coast, and along the Columbia River, which I've encircled in red here. They differ from other subspecies both genetically and morphologically. Next. So in the South Sound, larks are currently found breeding in only 9 locations on remnant prairie, including the Olympia Airport, which is A on this map. The one exception to traditional prairie where we find them is a really small population found on the Tacoma Narrows. We'll be familiar with that. Tacoma Narrows Airport. And what might have happened there, it's not traditional prairie, but it does have that open landscape. These might, or probably were birds that were reared on a prairie on J.B. Elms Gray Army Airfield and McCord or Olympia or somewhere like that. And as they're migrating outwards and inwards, they found this location, males who wanted to breed and attracted a few females. The highest population we've had Tacoma Narrows is 5 birds. So it really is a small population. It kind of shows you that these kind of sites can attract birds, but they're not historically tied to those birds. And so that population isn't increasing at all. It's very small and it stayed small. But it's the one exception, and that's C up there, way up on the top there. That's kind of outside the normal in terms of the birds being tied to these prairie locations. Next. So our agency also conducts standardized surveys for larks using a protocol that we developed with the research division based on research we've done. That relies on walking along established transects and recording all of larks by sight and sound and by male, female, juvenile, or unknown. We conduct these surveys across all of our breeding sites on a 3-year rotation unless we have a site that's declining. And in that case, we'll do it annually until we see that population increasing again. We don't want to wait 3 years to find out that that population on that site crashed. So as long as things are looking good, we'll skip. And the reason we do that on a rotation basis is that statistically, our research scientists have shown that we can track the population even by doing it on a 3-year rotation. It would be better, yes, to do it every year. Anything is better to count every year. We have so much work to do that while we're doing that, we're not doing something else. So we worked with our research scientists and our biometricians to say, yeah, you can do it on a 3-year rotation and you can still track that trend, and it will have, it will be a rigorous number that you get, meaning that it has value, it's a valid number. On the left are just some examples here, the Olympia Airport transects on the right. And those were Gray Army, or on the left, and those were Gray Army Airfield, with some of the results of a survey done in 2012 on the left, just to show you sort of what they look like when we get those points. In the years between doing the standardized surveys at our known locations, we do spend all that time looking for larks in other places. So we haven't found any larks breeding on any other locations, and we've almost run out of areas to look. We've looked across McNeil Island and Centralia Mine and Thun Field and all the other little airports and little pieces and big pieces, and we are pretty much out of places to look for larks. I'll tell you why, because they need big areas. But we do spend time looking. And I don't want people, I like to make sure people know that we are looking constantly for more pocket gophers and more street-turned larks to take the burden off of the ownership where we have them right now, such as the Port of Olympia. If we could find other breeding population, that helps everybody ease up the pressure a little bit. But we haven't been able to find any other breeding locations for larks. Next. So in 2021, Dr. Scott Pearson with our agency, with our research division, along with researchers from University of Washington, developed an integrated population model for the South Sound larks. And they analyzed at each of the locations that we had survey data for. Olympia Airport is the one, obviously still A. The airports on this are shown with a red airport or airplane, and the other sites are the prairie sites where we find larks. Here are the results from 2010 to 2020, showing several populations in decline with a couple of them stable. Total population estimate by sex is on the y-axis. Notice that we have very small populations at all of these sites. Most of them are less than 100 birds. Olympia Airport, again, A in the red box. You'll notice right away that in the past it supported a larger population of larks, the largest population of larks in the South Sound. We've had some population fluctuation at Olympia Airport, but a general decline, especially for females.
Are you willing to take questions during your presentation, or do you want to wait till?
I think I'd rather wait till the end, but if you want to write them down, yeah. And maybe we can come back to the slide, just for time's sake. Next. Now, because the females are more cryptic and silent, our process relies on recording the maximum number of males by sight and sound, and then correcting that number to account for what we call detection issues. That is what we might have missed during the survey. And this is done, there's mathematics and statistics and all of that done. And that's why we have a research section that are the brainiacs that know how to do all this. I can't really go into detail about how those corrections are done, but I'd be happy to, have questions put forward to Dr. Pearson. He would explain all of that, or even meet with you to explain it if you needed to. So here are the 2018 to 2023 uncorrected male counts for Olympia Airport in red compared to the other Washington and Oregon sites. And you're going to notice two things. Number one, we didn't survey in 2021 and 2022 because of the increase in 2020, which again, by our protocol, if we have an increase, we go back onto the 3-year rotation. But then in 2023, we had a 31% decline compared to the last 3-year average on Olympia Airport. And so the airport has graciously allowed us to survey again this year. And just one thing to keep in mind is that because lark populations, as you see, can fluctuate year to year depending on how successful they were at nesting, how successful they were at rearing their young, which is all obviously dictated by weather patterns and other things. You know, we do look at a trend. We look at several years trend, as you saw on those graphs. We don't really focus so much on the year-to-year fluctuation, other than to indicate that we should survey again as we're doing this year. So street-torn larks were state listed by WDFW as endangered species in 2006, and they were federally listed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as threatened in 2013 due to significant population declines, their low genetic diversity, and inbreeding. We found genetic inbreeding, which is bad for any species. Range reduction, and inbreeding happens when you have too few breeders and they're all breeding together and you don't have genetic interchange. It weakens the population. Range reduction, ongoing loss and conversion of habitat, weakness of the regulatory mechanisms to protect them at the time of listing, both native and non-native predators, human-related mortality and disturbance is huge for larks, and other factors. And again, I'll refer you to these various state and federal plans that are on the website to really get in deep in larks, more than I can do in the time I've got today. Next. WDFW, our state, has not drafted a state recovery plan for larks, and we may actually, now that they're federally listed, we may adopt the federal plan when it is finalized. But this is basically the bulk, the content of what the federal draft recovery plan for street-torn larks contains. You probably can't read that table at this distance, but basically the draft federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery plan calls for just over 5,700 individual larks to be distributed across 6 recovery zones, with a population target identified for every core site, such as Olympia Airport being a core site, and other matrix lands in order for larks to be delisted. So you see that the gray bar in the very bottom corner, there's that 5,715 birds about that is the target we need to reach. But you've also got, for each of the regions from the South Puget Sound all the way down to the Willamette Valley, you've got targets within that. Note that our most current population is 1,519 birds, and we need to get to 5,700. So we have a long way to go. Next. One very important thing to note about larks is that they require very large open sites that are hundreds of acres in order to breed. They use these wide open spaces above their breeding grounds to display, to court females, to defend their territories. You know, you've heard the saying, you know, going out on the lark. I mean, that's what larks do. Like, larks use the space. They need space, and they go and they do these elaborate dives and displays and that. They cannot do that in confined space. They cannot tolerate confined space. They will give up a site. They will lose breeding opportunities because they're just not programmed to work what they need to do in a confined space. So this openness, it might be contiguous grasslands like many of our sites in the South Sound, or it may be grassland that's bordered by open water, such as we find on the Columbia River and the outer coast, or it might be expansive agricultural land like they find in the Willamette Valley. But what all of these 3 things have in common is that wide open airspace. It's critical to maintain that open airspace at their breeding sites. Next. Another thing that's really important to remember about larks is that they avoid edges. So research done by Anderson and Pearson in 2015 shown here shows the relationship between the number of larks that were detected, that means they were seen or heard during a survey, and their distance to a hard edge, like a building or a tree line. The results clearly showed that larks avoided being within 50 meters of a hard edge, and that their numbers progressively increased the further they were from those hard edges. This should be considered when discussing any alteration or development at any occupied breeding site. Any new hard surfaces or increase in edge have a potential to impact the breeding population. This includes any development that will change the airspace to be narrower or irregular, which again, what happens is it increases the amount of edge relative to the interior. So they're looking for that wide open interior. You might have the same amount of space broken up, but from a lark's perspective, it's very different. Next. So for the sake of time, I'll leave enough for some questions. I'm just going to briefly touch on a few other prairie species that were historically on the Olympia Airport, but are no longer there due to declining populations coupled with habitat conversion. And that's with the exception of the Oregon Vesper Sparrow, which we do get some sightings on the Olympia Airport. So the Oregon Vesper Sparrow, it's a rare race which breeds in western Washington prairies. It winters in central California and south up to Baja. It's a light colored sparrow with buffy brown streaks on the crown and throat and a black back. It's got an eye ring, which is how we can differentiate it from many of the other grassland sparrows. This ground nesting bird feeds primarily on insects and seeds, and so it's vulnerable to predators, including domestic pets. The Oregon Vesper Sparrow is a state endangered bird in Washington and under federal review. It is more endangered than street-torn larks, technically, but it's not one that we've routinely surveyed for. But starting this year, and again, one of the reasons we didn't is because this population crash for Vesper sparrows has happened quite quickly over the last many years, and it's become a concern to us. So starting this year, WDFW, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and some of our partners will begin standardized surveys for Oregon Vesper sparrows. So we're just putting those together. The current estimate is 100 Vesper sparrows for the entire South Sound region. That's all that we may have left. We think there might be some we're not finding, but unlikely, because we've looked pretty hard. Partners have looked hard. The western gray squirrel it's gray with numerous white-tipped hairs on its back and belly. It has a very long bushy tail. This is another species that used to be quite prevalent across our South Sound prairies and our oak woodlands that now is really confined to just the JBLM. They feed primarily on pine cones, acorns, and other nuts, and they'll eat some fungi, berries, and insects. They're found in 3 areas of Washington state, including the South Sound region. They rely heavily on an oak prairie woodland. So as we remove those oaks, we used to have them all the way to Lakewood where all the oaks were, and down south here and where the oaks were, those oaks were pretty extensive. And as we cut them up, the squirrel became less and less common. These are not to be confused with the eastern gray squirrel, which is the non-native squirrel that you see in all your neighborhoods and around your houses, which has that scrawny little reddish thin tail. If you saw these guys, they're absolutely gorgeous. Their tail comes up behind their head and loops around, and it's really bushy. And I've helped trap these guys, and they're like cats. They don't have a smell. They clean themselves constantly. They have no odor on them, whatever. They're so clean. And then I think of these eastern gray squirrels we have that are just so scrawny looking. And yeah, I wish we still had these. These western gray squirrel is a state threatened species. It's a federal species of concern. Next. A couple of our butterflies. Our South Sound prairies historically supported very large populations of beautiful butterflies, as do many prairies across the world. But these butterflies have largely disappeared as the prairie habitat was converted. Some examples here are the Puget blue. It's a very delicate blue butterfly that occurs only on Puget Sound and Sequim prairies. They're a colonial species, so they only come together as a colony. Their host plant is the lupin, and they are a state candidate for listing. Taylor's checker spot is a beautiful black, white, and orange pattern checker spot. It's one of our more colorful prairie butterflies. It occurs in the Puget prairies and the maritime prairies along the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the San Juan Islands. Its host plant is both a native and an introduced plantain. And it is both a state and federally listed endangered species due to declines. And then we have the Martin skipper, which is also occurs on remnant prairies of Thurston County and South Central Cascades. We think that it depends on Idaho fescue, a native grass, as its larval host plant. And it is a state endangered and federal candidate species. Next. And so there are a lot of additional plants and animal species that depend on prairies, including all of those shown here. Many of those are declining or listed in Washington, such as the pond turtle and the Huilia, the paintbrush. We're covering paintbrush through all of our propagation, the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatches. So again, just some more species that are tied to prairies that are declining along with prairies that at one time probably existed on bush prairie and were, probably pretty common. Next. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation, and I think we have time for questions.
Yes, I think the point of the work sessions is to give people a chance to interact and ask questions. I think I've just been consulting with our former president, and we can go up till 5:30 today, but we do have another presentation, so I think we have up to 20 minutes to continue Thank you, Michelle. And I wanted to invite Commissioner Isles, since he's remote and I'm going to forget to check in with him. I wanted to see first if he has any questions or comments.
Well, thank you for not forgetting about me, Commissioner Vasavada. I appreciate that very much. And also, thanks so much for this presentation. That was a lot of great information. I learned a terribly large amount of new information for me today. So that was great. Thank you. I do have a couple of questions about the pocket gopher and the number of subspecies that there are. There's seems to be quite a lot of them, and I'm wondering what differences, what differentiates each species or subspecies from the others. Is it something geographical? Is it physical? What differentiates those subspecies?
Yeah, it's both of those. First of all, I think the most important information is the genetics. So, you know, as genetic research and our ability to do genetics subspecies differentiation has improved all these years, we can collect DNA from individual animals and do genetic studies through our genetics lab and understand how those species are similar or different. And so, you know, as I mentioned in the presentation, we did a genetic study collecting hair samples, which contains DNA. You can pull a hair and it has a little piece of DNA that comes up with it on the hair follicle. And we were able to genetically differentiate these 6 subspecies. I will say that there were a couple ones that we could only get a few samples. So the sample size was small for like 2 of them, and we'd like to do more of that. But with the sample, with other ones, we had a lot more samples from the Olympia pocket gophers and others. But even with having said that, it fairly showed that we had these 6 different clades or 6 different genetic groupings, at least 6 of them. And morphologically, if you were to measure things out back in the day, the research that was, or the publications when biologists back in the day, and you know, early 1900s, they used to do measurements and they would measure things out. And there's some publications measuring the difference between these subspecies and showing like, you know, foot length is different and body length is different and things like that. So it can be physical. And the last thing I would say is that, yes, it is by geographic area as well. So you see on the map how we could encircle a group, especially when we had the one with the purple slide that had those purple blocks from the genetic study. You can see how those genes were all the same. They're all located in the same geographic area, meaning that you didn't have animals whose genes were here and then also here on the other side of Thurston County that were the same subspecies. That subspecies that had the same genes were all collected in the same area. They were all, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Because my second question was if there was a point in time where we decided that tracking the different subspecies was relevant. So it sounds like it was well before the DNA science was available that they did find differences and were tracking it.
Yeah, both Department of Fish and Wildlife, most state agencies, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service now recognize that subspecies deserve recognition in terms of their listing status rather than the species overall. We could list a certain subspecies, but we found Department of Fish and Wildlife that all 6 subspecies warranted listing at the time that we listed them because they were all in the same predicament. They were all declining, and we were losing all, and we already lost 2 of them. We had 8 originally, we all lost 2 of them. So, but state agencies and federal agencies do, for the most part, I can't think of any that don't offhand, recognize subspecies when they do a population, like analysis of what its trends are looking like, and as far as listing consideration.
All right, thank you. That's all I have for now.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Commissioner Tong.
Yes, thank you so much for the information.
You're welcome.
Learned a lot. I was curious about the decline, and that sounded like a pretty big decline. I think you said 31% at the Olympia Airport. the last 3 years. Do you know why that might be? Are there any hypotheses?
I don't know why. And like I said, we surveyed for 3 years. And the last survey that we had done, we had an increasing trend, so we didn't survey again. And then we surveyed in 2023 and found that significant decline. Same biologist, me and my assistant who surveys, we've years of experience. We were actually surprised. We thought the survey felt like a normal survey, that we didn't feel like we missed anything. So we were actually surprised when we got done at the numbers. We're curious as to how these warming effects are affecting animals across a range. You imagine these grasslands are very dry to begin with, you know, the Olympia Airport. It's very dry landscape. Whether or not insects are thriving and surviving for food when they should be, whether animals are dying from starvation because there's not enough insects because of heat waves, whether juveniles survive because of heat waves. I mean, they're out there, you know, they're still being reared up until like June and July when we've been having these really high temperatures. We have no idea what that is. You add on top of that, they're at these sites where we now have some pavement, that increases that heat level, right? So it could be a lot of factors, but obviously one of the ones we're thinking about are these changing climate change effects.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The other thing is inbreeding. Like I said, we realize that larks, we have some genetic inbreeding, and we actually have been doing some research to move animals around to introduce new genetics. So far, we haven't been successful in doing that, but it is something we want to continue to investigate. It's called genetic rescue when you do that, when you specifically try to incorporate new genes into a population with understanding that, you know, these animals genetically are driven from the locations that they come from. So, you know, imagine we take you and we move you to the middle of the ocean kind of thing, you know, you don't want a scenario like that. So we take all those things into consideration.
Thank you. Commissioner Harding?
Thank you again. You know your stuff. It's awesome. When you say the Olympia Airport, and this maybe Warren can translate, do you mean within the fence, or do you mean Newmarket Industrial Campus when you're saying the habitat for lark and gopher? And
Well, where we do the surveys is the Olympia Airport. When I say Olympia Airport, I mean within the fenced area. Okay, but well, I guess I should step back on that, because for example, when I say the Olympia, when we did pocket gopher surveys, we did them within the Olympia Airport. Usually, okay, when I say Olympia Airport, I mean within the fenced area, but we also did surveys on the leased lands next door.
that's where you said there was less gophers specifically on the leased land. than-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we made sure to survey all of that east side, in case the airport wanted to, you know, investigate maybe doing more development out towards the east side or what have you, the south approach zone, just to understand where we have that difference there in terms of density. But yeah, so when I say the Olympia Airport inclines or decreases, like for the lark population, it's within the defined fenced area.
Okay. And then when this may be getting into the HCP conversation, which I recognize is not your domain. Do you work with US Fish and Wildlife on that?
Yeah, we've provided a lot of input on that. Most of the science history of these species came from our agency. We reviewed it thoroughly, provided very extensive review comments to the Bush Prairie HCP team, which we're waiting to hear back from them on how our comments were, you know, if they need more input from us. But yeah, we do on all the HCPs. We are very heavily involved in reviewing them. Now, having said that, it is an agreement between US Fish and Wildlife Service and the jurisdiction. So WDFW does a thorough scientific review and comments, but we don't have a say in where our comments go from there. We don't have any way to, we ask for some input back, but we don't have any control over whether or not our comments are addressed or even incorporated.
Got it. So as we're looking at 250 acre, either core contiguous parcels or complexes where there's some separation, and also looking at finding those within the UGA, there's a conflict there, given that there aren't those large swaths of land available. is how much distance can be between the complexes? And then can the airport runway within the fence be used as mitigation land? Or,
So, you mean, so, yeah, what is the distance between those complexes? I'd have to look back to the US Fish and Wildlife Service Recovery Plan. I'm not sure that there is a distance requirement versus just you need to have, X number of areas established, recovery areas established. I don't know the distance between them. And your second question was, does the runway itself count as mitigation?
within the fence, essentially, can that be set aside, given that it is already the prime habitat of these species? Can adjacent to the pavement be set aside as mitigation land for the purposes of the HCP?
Well, I don't know if it counts as mitigation credit. So let's, first of all, let's consider habitat. So pavement is not habitat.
Understood.
Yeah, pavement, the grassland that borders it
Understood.
is definitely where the soils are for gophers and where the grasslands are for larks. That's habitat. How that acreage, that 800 plus acres of the Olympia Airport, if that's considered mitigation land under the HCP, I have no idea. I don't know if that qualifies. One thing I do know that's in there, there are stringent requirements for maintaining the habitat into perpetuity for those species to qualify,
And improving it.
improving the habitat for those species. So if it did, it'd have to meet these other benchmarks, because all of these lands that eventually get mitigation credit have to be for the species into perpetuity, managed for the species into perpetuity. And for example, have some kind of an endowment or some kind of other funding that will pay for that ongoing maintenance of the habitat.
And this is an uninformed question, but there was something in the legislature last session that allows you to essentially move these mitigation properties. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? No? And they're looking at doing it in Tumwater, and anyway, I'll follow up with you on that question. Because I don't understand how that works. Okay, thank you.
I should mention, I didn't mention in this presentation that we do have a working group, which actually, I was just saying, we started it here in this room. We have the Larks and Airports Working Group that has been going on since 2013. And we brought that together, WDFW and US Fish and Wildlife Service, with management representation from all of our airports that have larks or may potentially have larks, so that we could work together on, helping the airports continue to function as an airport and meet all of their needs as an airport without further compromising these species. So that was the intent of this working group meeting. And one of our first ideas that we had as a group was that crafting these best management practices. Like, how can we, what are the activities that need to happen on an airport for safety and security and functioning that could potentially impact larks. In this case, it's the larks working group meeting. We don't have one for pocket gophers. But things like mowing, timing of mowing, how high to mow the vegetation, when you mow, lighting, all of these, how you do projects, how you phase projects in terms of timing outside of the breeding season, if you can, all of these things. So we've encapsulated all of that brain dump from our site managers and our wildlife experts into these best management practices.
There's a property owner who has their HCP in Thurston County who's had really strong success in improving habitat, and they've recalculated their mitigation credits based on how successful they've been in improving the habitat. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So it's working.
I have a few questions too. So one thing is, you showed us the prairie soils extent, and a lot of it is degraded habitat. And it seems like the airport is, not just our airport, Shelton Airport, and JBLM lands are particularly prime areas. Is that because, could it potentially be because of the way they are maintained, that they are maintained in a way that keeps them as contiguous, more prairie-like areas than areas that are in private ownership and that are smaller parcels?
Absolutely.
Okay, so in a way, it seems like, although it's absolutely our duty to continue to shepherd and steward these lands, we have created through these, it just so happens we've helped be like refuges.
Yeah.
For disappearing
Yeah,
species.
through the site maintenance that you do on these airports and keeping that structure short, yeah, larks and gophers have been able to continue to exist on them, for sure.
Great.
Site management.
And then I think Commissioner Harding was asking this in a slightly different way, but you mentioned how we go out and try to find more to remove the burden.
Mhm.
And so then the question is like, well, that's relevant to which populations when you do that, right? Given your genetic piece, because I wonder, when you show us the Mazama pocket gopher, for example, I had no idea its range and populations extend into Oregon and California.
Yeah.
And that's the subspecies, correct? So, just like your jurisdiction is not a county, are Pierce County, Thurston County and parts of Lewis County, and this species is not limited to a county.
Right.
It runs up and down that area. You mentioned that the federal habitat conservation planning is an agreement between the feds and the jurisdiction, and by that you meant the county, right?
Yeah, or the
So
cities.
The locus of responsibility is a county or a city.
Mhm.
Are you aware of do counties and cities ever partner? I mean, the species crosses these jurisdictional boundaries. Do we ever partner to meet the objectives?
Well, Olympia Airport, the Port of Olympia is partnering with the city of Tumwater. So there's a partnership there, but if you're saying a cross-state boundary partnership, we do work almost all of our species, not so much Mazama pocket gophers, but many of our species, we do work across state boundaries on recovery. I will note that although the species runs from pocket gophers, Mazama pocket gophers go from Washington all the way down to Northern California, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did find the same declining trend in Oregon and California, enough to prompt them to list the species. So it's the same scenario across their range. We don't have a partnership with Oregon or California on Mazama pocket gopher recovery. We do have for other species. We don't have one because we've had so much effort and need to resolve this issue just here in Thurston County. It's pretty much taken up all of our time. But needless to say, if we could bolster the populations anywhere within their range, if it happened in California or if it happened in Oregon, we would still need to reach some population goals for Washington State, right? Yeah, because, a species, you never, let's say, for lack of a better term, put all your eggs in one basket, right? You need to recover them across it, widely distributed. We call it representation, richness of representation, so that if anything happens on one end, you've got these populations that can potentially survive elsewhere. So we would still have some Washington recovery goals that we'd have to meet. Oregon and California have their own goals. But if we work together and they could do more recovery in those other states, yes, it would put us in a better position for sure.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's answering your question.
It absolutely is. And then one last little question. As we're grappling in Washington, you said how much attention, because it's almost an issue of first impression, where our Growth Management Act and where we're saying development should happen is exactly the place where these endangered species are. Oh gosh, I remembered another question. But so are you aware in California of any, on the Mazama pocket gopher especially, any similar kind of pinch where there's limited areas that can be protected and where the community is coming up against similar boundaries?
I'm not, but I could imagine that anywhere pocket gophers exist across their range, for both the Mazamas and others, we probably have this pinch. Because remember, this is flat for the most part, it's flat ground that doesn't grow a lot of timber. So it's ideal for development. It's ripe for development, right? So I would imagine wherever it's found, and I don't know personally that situation in California, but I can almost guarantee you that wherever we find those flat prairies, we have this pinch of development wanting to happen there. And by the fact that they're western parts of those states, which from Washington all the way down to California, our biggest growth rate is the western sides of those states. So we have a prime flat habitat with a nice population increase for people.
you. It's 4:34, but I'd like to extend this conversation by as much as 6 minutes. If there's any additional, we have staff around the table or back to a commissioner, if there's just anything else, and I'll just.
Said one quick question. On the lark populations, I noticed that as the populations decline in your surveys, other places population increase. I wonder, do larks ever sort of move around and breed in other locations, or are they really?
They
all-
have very high site fidelity, extremely, and we know that from banding studies. So we do have a little bit of movement, especially young males, get here and their territory is full and they go to another site. But for the most part, they have a very high site fidelity, even so much that the ones that are hatched out from site come back to that site. So they're just, when some species don't, but this larks are one that high site fidelity. They're also neotrophs. We should mention that they leave Washington in the winter. They go down south in the winter and then they come back up to their breeding grounds. So they are not here year round, which again lends itself well for us to be able to phase airport needs around the breeding season, right? So we should try to work together to say during the breeding season, because it's fairly short. I agree, it does happen to be the only time we might have good weather for development, unfortunately. But the other time of the year, they're not here. Late summer, they're hatched out, all the way winter, fall, they're gone. Early spring, they're gone.
Sean, Warren? Then I'll ask one last question. You showed us so many different species in addition to the ones that we've been more focused on here. Where are they? It sounds like some of them you're starting to study, or the science is less developed than it now is on the pocket gophers. So should we assume that that's sort of like an augury of things to come? And
No, some of those species we've studied a lot. The
Okay.
Western pond turtle, that was up there, that's our oldest recovery program in the agency. We've been doing that for 35 plus years, trying to recover Western pond turtle. So like that's a species that has a long history. Some of the other ones are not as critically imperiled as the ones we've been talking about that are listed. They all of them, for the most part, are candidate species, meaning they're in our pile. And as we take one off and we spend several years doing all the study, gathering all the historical data, poring over all the publications from the past, working with all the other museums that collected specimens from Washington, and then going out and doing these elaborate studies, we write a status report for that species, and we decide from that status report, it warrants listing and listing at this level, or it doesn't warrant listing. And it gets moved aside, and then we take the next species off that candidate pile. So you can imagine, that's the issue with US Fish and Wildlife Service too. We have a lot of species that need attention, but we've only got so much money. And to do it right and to do it well, it takes time. We don't want a list of species that we haven't thoroughly investigated, right? Because it has a lot of impetus on what happens on the land. So it just takes a while. So those species, some of them we've been studying for a while, some of them are waiting for their time. And while they're waiting, some of them are declining. But, you can only do so much with the money you have.
well, thank you. With that, Commissioner Isle, President Isle, would you like a last word to thank or close this conversation?
Well, yeah, I think that's a good point. We'll just say thank you. That was some really good information that I'm sure we will all keep in consideration. So thank you for being here today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Sean, thank you for inviting her on our behalf and putting this together.
You're welcome.
All right, with that, we're going to move on to the next item in our agenda, and Camille St. Ange, our Director of Strategic Initiatives and Commission Affairs, is going to give us a briefing on strategic initiatives.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you again. My name's Camille St. Ange, Director of Strategic Initiatives and Commission Affairs. Today's a briefing for you. We're going to talk about our strategic initiatives performance in 2023 and how we did as an organization. And then we're going to take a deep dive on the Waterfront Center and the roadmap and community reflections we had. So I'm going to do my best to not speak 100 miles an hour on the first chunk, but I want to leave the bulk of the time. So I've been asked to center around the waterfront center for you, so. And I'm hoping that this will be a conversation along the way, so I encourage you to ask questions as we tick through this, okay? So please don't hold them to the end.
On
So
that note, Commissioner Isle, how will you indicate if you have a question? Do you have a way to raise your hand?
I'll just blurt something out, I guess.
Oh, good. That sounds good. Now that it's just us chickens.
Yes, I appreciate that approach, Commissioner Ayala. All right, so there are 6 strategic initiatives. Earlier this year, during our orientation for commissioners, I talked about and I want to say my assessment of what was going on within the organization, get familiar, and I talked about, my discovery phase. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the results and what we have actually accomplished. Out of anything, everybody, really wants to know, what have we done? Having said that, I also believe it's important to recognize that 2 of the 5 commissioners here were a part of developing the initiatives. The executive team who was part of that, I would say 85–95% of them are gone today. And that when we talk about our performance on these initiatives, that a staffing gap was a significant part of whether we were able to execute tasks or not. So in 2023, the Port of Olympia identified 60 actions that were associated with the 6 initiatives. Out of those 60 actions for 2023, 58% of them were complete, 10% are in progress right now, and then 32% were not started. And I'm going to walk you through the 6 initiatives and their individual performance. So out of these initiatives, culture, 7 of those were completed. There's another 1 that's in progress. I want to call your attention to communications. You're going to say, wow, there's just 4 listed. That's all. There was 4 actions for that particular initiative, and all 4 were completed in 2023. And then there's varying ranges of percentages of completion for each of these initiatives. And I'm going to walk you through each one individually so you can see how they performed. For culture, 88% of the tasks, the actions were completed. And focusing on what we've accomplished in that theme, some significant highlights were there was a salary survey that was completed and 3 job classifications that took place. 10 policies were updated, and we brought back in-person all-staff meetings. So now there's 10 all-staff meetings a year, along with 2 employee in-person events. We also have weekly online virtual all-staff meetings. So they're a 15-minute check-in. So we had 18 of those last year, and I anticipate we'll probably have about 50 of those this year. So overall, this particular initiative is moved along nicely. Governance. Governance is related to 5 commissioners coming on board, and we've accomplished that and getting the organization ready. You're asking, why is it only 67% complete? There were a couple of items that were not completed related to this, and that it had to do with modernizing our resolutions and bringing that to the commission.
Camille, could you modernizing our resolutions? Do you mean what does that mean?
Assessing, doing some research analysis, looking at other ports resolutions, looking at ours, looking for an opportunity to improve it, working with the commissioners to review a draft and making any adjusted changes. I anticipate that will be put on the plate for 2024. And that if we see the commission has any opportunities to adjust that we might do that. That will be a conversation that happens with the commission, and it'll be based on looking at other court resolutions and seeing if there's opportunities to do things that might enhance ours.
Well, I think the delegation of authority resolution was already flagged as a priority, and that would be part of that then. It was
Sure.
already a priority.
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay, finance. So finance had a 30% completion rate. The finance team had a significant gap in staffing. We did have a finance director for a permanent finance director for a small period of time. And then that position went vacant again. It wasn't permanent until, Tad wasn't permanent until February. He was in a temporary role. He's not here this evening, but so even though that wasn't a 2023 accomplishment, I thought it was worth highlighting that, and that Tad is putting together a new finance team and it's nearly complete. Despite not having a permanent finance director, we did get the budget developed, and then James and the operations team did projections for capital investments, and we enhanced the educational component of our budget. And I anticipate that in 2024, we go back to do the budget. We're going to see even more enhancement in terms of education and helping the community understand our port finances. The pieces of this that weren't complete were pretty much entirely related to adjusting our finance policies that we have on our books. Restoration, this is our environmental focus. So with this one, we have 62% complete. I want to call out a couple of highlights. The $2.2 million in appropriation from the Department of Commerce in the 2023 legislative session was absolutely instrumental in advancing our work for the port. Those monies were used as a match for the grant that we're using to fund the research and analysis of the sediments today. And because we have those match dollars, we're able to begin that work. And so essentially we have a remedial action grant that has match requirements, and this appropriation was that it was essentially given to us by the state legislature, and we use that to match our environmental grants we had through the Department of Ecology. There was a big gap in terms of staffing for this initiative in the year. So you're hearing the theme. We have hired, though, a director of environment and a Bud Inlet project manager, and we have activated our remedial action grant and a number of public outreach meetings. And I think it was notable that we were able to attend the Squaxin Island Tribal Council meeting and update them. I hope that in 2024 that we will be out to Nisqually and giving them an update. I would suggest we do that after we have the data results back so we can share with them what we learned. Communications, 100% complete. We have a communications manager now, and we did a workload assessment on that position. And he developed a organizational communications plan, and some of the work was eliminated from that position, but not entirely. I can say that there has been a significant increase in our social media activity and reach. So you've probably heard me say this before. Our social media is essentially the modern day version of a news release. This is how we reach people. We are our own media outlets today. A traditional news release is not necessarily the best way to reach everyone, but we still keep traditional types of media going on. And we've activated our social media in a bigger way than we have in the past. Tabor and his team have also now put a newsroom in place on our website. We have a blog, which we didn't have before, and we had some small changes to our homepage to make updates easier to find. Okay, so here is the Waterfront Center, the initiative you're most likely interested in. So here are some highlights, and then I'm going to walk us through more in depth on this particular initiative. So in 2023, the port went to the legislature and they asked for the appropriation that they were awarded in 2022 to be rescoped. So Port of Olympia had asked for $5 million that would be used for planning and design and some construction of a waterfront center that would include mixed use space and port administrative offices. The legislature didn't award $5 million. They awarded $250,000. So the port went back to the legislature and had an amendment made to the scope of what that work would cover. And essentially, the $250,000 now is for schematic design and planning.
Can you restate, because I do better with writing. What was it that it was for? You said for offices and.
So that for the waterfront center, so
Yes, what does it
a building that would house the administrative offices, mixed use space. So it would have a consumer space on the first floor. And then it would have administrative offices for the port, a new marina office on the first floor. And originally it had the estuarium that might be involved in that. The estuarium has since made the decision not to participate in that, but that is an example of what could be on our first floor of this building.
Can I just follow up to catch up? Do
course.
you know why the estuarium decided not to participate?
Yeah, the capital investment, their board felt the capital investment to build out that space was more than they could raise funds for. And so they chose to move into a space somewhere in Olympia that's about $1 million capital investment campaign. And to move into the space was estimated an $8 million capital investment campaign. And that's a big lift for their organization.
And I believe they're staying in there, they're purchasing the building they're currently in, and that's what the capital campaign is launching.
So the other highlight for this is there was a presentation given to our Citizens Advisory Committee by Thomas Architecture, who developed the master plan. We actually formed a port team. I know I mentioned that a big piece of some of our performance here has been related to gaps. And then we started creating a roadmap for 2024. And I think the roadmap for 2024 is probably what you're going to be most interested in. But for the sake of not having walked through this project before with you, I want to walk you through what led us to where we are today, so you have background. So this is a bit of a deeper dive. Here's the,
Sorry.
I had the same response.
that was the only picture I had. So this is our project.
Getting a headshot.
I think the Joel's gonna use that one.
So this is our project team we have formed. James Sommer is our capital assets program manager, and he is the project manager for this initiative. Clarita Maddox, she represents our real estate team. Tabor brings marketing and communications. TJ is our harbor senior manager, and he had some legacy knowledge. He was here throughout the actual visioning and master plan development. And you can see myself there. And then on deck is Tad Kopf, our Director of Finance, and we anticipate we are going to be bringing him into this project next month as we start to work on a finance strategy. And then Alex Smith.
Crazy aunt.
She's on day one, but so she's on deck. We didn't assign her anything quite yet. Community partners. So if you weren't aware, Thomas Architecture Studios is a local architecture firm. They led a community visioning, a master plan development for Destination Waterfront. And that Destination Waterfront included built the Waterfront Center, for lack of a better word. I don't know if that's the permanent name for it, but a waterfront center that would have a plaza and potentially an esplanade attached to that along East Bay. Experience Olympia and beyond. Tabor and I have been in constant contact with them since we started in 2023 and all the way up to 2024. They've been acting as an advisory role, and then they conducted a visioning exercise that we participated in that included the Waterfront Center, the Port Peninsula in that Community Visioning. And they have given us advice to continue on with our master plan. They said it aligns nicely with what they're seeing and all of the data that they had come through in their master plan, and said, forge forward, you know, you're doing a good job in following your master plan.
I'm sorry, what master plan?
The Destination Waterfront Master Plan that Thomas Architecture developed through Community Visioning. And in fact, I'll go into that a little bit more and answer questions about that for you, Commissioner. Our other community partner is the Port Citizen Advisory Committee. Thomas Architecture did a presentation to them specifically last summer, and then did a walking tour that members of the community can join. And then they've developed a subcommittee with outreach planning as an assignment from the Port of Olympia Commission. Before we move into the visioning, I want to talk to you about some current challenges and opportunities though. So right now, and you'll see where I might be going with this when we talk about community visioning. So right now we have low visibility. There was a gap in staff. There weren't people working on this. And so the visibility of this project hasn't been very active because there wasn't anything to report or get people involved in. That has caused what we identify as partner and interlocal confidence might be an issue as well. There's opportunities though. We need to keep our advisory committee engaged, and some other opportunities is while this, the development, the planning, the schematic design, the permitting is taking place, we can make some interim improvements that align with the recommendations from the community. We can clean up the peninsula. We can invest in Billy Frank Jr. Park and Trail. We can make some interim improvements to the event spaces that we have today, so that when people come into the Port Peninsula down Marine Drive, that they're seeing something that's more inviting than it might look today. And we had some feedback from the architectural firms who responded to our RFQ that pointed this out. I think every firm pointed out that we need to address what it looks like from Marine Drive down to Anthony's Hearth Fire. Planning and funding, there are challenges with that. Staff vacancies affected planning, and it also affected integrated planning. And we had a need for some internal processes and efficiencies. With that, there are definitely opportunities, and this is no news to you here. We've got opportunities in the bipartisan infrastructure law, and then there's economic development grants that are integrated planning grants at the federal level, and state integrated planning grants that we can take advantage of. And those should definitely be part of our funding strategy. I want to pause just in case I've been talking too fast and Commissioner Ayala hasn't felt there was an opportunity to step in.
No, not yet. I would have blurted something out if I.
Okay. So I want to talk about the master plan that was developed. I know that you weren't a part of that master plan when it was developed. I wasn't here either, so I've done investigation. I met with Thomas Architecture. I met with some staff that were here to learn about this, and then we have documentation that you're going to see here today. It's quite a large master plan. It's on our website, and I believe it was in a binder that I have if you want to look at it in more detail. So there was a master plan grant that we were awarded by CURB, the Community Economic Revitalization Board. And that grant paid for the Destination Waterfront Master Planning. Thomas Architecture was contracted to develop that community visioning and outreach related to the master plan. And what I have up here today is I want to show you that they had the community weigh in on this building, the Waterfront Center, what it might look like, what they would want to see, what it looks like, and what it might offer. And they overwhelmingly said, we want a building that brings in the look and feel of being part of the Pacific Northwest. And you can see the different options and how they went down from there. To the right of this slide, you'll see where the position of that building is most likely to be. So if you're driving down Marine Drive and you look off to the east, you see the entire marina and all of the slips. And you can see I've placed that, or I should say James has placed a white square of where that will be. If you know where the existing marina office is, it's right in that vicinity.
And just for historical context, there was a pretty significant amount of discussion on that potentially being located somewhere else. And the staff did quite a bit of work as to educating us as to why that needs to be the location for the functionality of the marina.
Anything you want to add to that, James?
Nope, that's good.
Okay. What we also learned through this community visioning and the surveys, there was about 500 people who participated in the visioning exercises. And then there was 4 times that participated in surveys, is they told us that what kind of public access would you like? And they said, hey, small boat resources. And that could look like a lot of things. It could be, kayaks, it could be paddle boards, it could be, I don't know, little paddle boats. Extended walking trail. And if you've been looking across the country, that is definitely a trend. People want, in the inner city areas, they want to have walking trails, a place to go and access waterfronts, places that they don't have in their neighborhood. Also, they asked that we incorporate public access, parks, green space, plazas, community sailing, an event center, places that people can commune. This isn't very surprising. You see, this is something you see on many waterfronts. That they're developed this way. And then they also asked that we continue to consider environmental remediation and stewardship. So as we think about what the community has asked for, and we're in the midst of planning, I want to call out to you what many of you have already expressed, and that is a need for an integrated planning approach. We have a few different things happening simultaneously, and they can't run on individual tracks successfully. So the waterfront planning and the master plan, along with Bud Inlet, Deschutes Estuary, and interlocal planning and permitting all need to be integrated together. We also need to consider if there's any master planning that's going to take place for the marine terminal. And anything that happens, all of these need to work in concert. And there's a number of different benefits that they can feed into each other. For example, as Sean's managing the Bud Inlet restoration and they're pulling out dredging material, one of the benefits of that dredging material is it could be used to help mitigate sea level rise. So if you see on the right-hand side, all of the blue area is where that's where you're going to see flooding when there's a storm surge or a king tide, or especially a king tide with low atmospheric pressure. We saw that about 18 months ago when all of this area flooded. So considering the sea level rise and Bud Inlet restoration, Deschutes Estuary, all of that planning happening simultaneously is really critical. That doesn't mean that we don't stop any of this planning that we're doing today. It means we start to integrate all of the pieces so they feed off of each other. Since we were talking about sea level rise, which is absolutely important to mitigate, as you saw on this slide, even if sea level rise isn't affecting where that little pink building is, where we would have a waterfront center, you still can't get to it because the roads are going to be impassable during a flooding area. There's a number of ways to mitigate sea level rise. There's gates, there's flood walls, you can create living shorelines, and there's some diagrams to the right, but here's something to consider. I think it's very helpful to see how some other communities have approached this, and specifically Port of Vancouver. And you can see how they have restored and developed their shoreline. Port of Bellingham in the lower right-hand corner, both of these being cleanup sites. And then Point Ruston, which is really, that's local. It's not necessarily a port property, but it was a cleanup site. And you can see how they've raised their esplanades and their plazas in order to, and walkways in order to accommodate. This is an early rendering in 2020 of what a waterfront center might look like. So many people have been trying to activate the waterfront since 1980. When Tabor and I started here last July, we started cleaning out a number of, marketing materials that needed to be, they were aged. And we found inside there back in 1980, a drawing of what the very first visuals of what people envisioned for our community. This is not new. And this is something that our community has wanted for so many years. I was just shocked to see that. So if this generation can get it done, I think the people of the past would be really happy to see that we were able to turn the peninsula into something that the community can enjoy. This is definitely not a rendering that I want you to like hold in your heart that this is what's going to look like. This is from 2020. So I thought it would be helpful though for you to see how this might look in the future. What you're looking at now, and I've put a larger timeline here for you so you could make notes on this. This is just a preliminary 2024 roadmap, and this might help you see how you might progress as an organization to advance this project this year. And it began with a request for qualifications for an architectural firm. James, you want to share about that, the RFQ?
Yeah, certainly. So we realized that we needed to go out for an RFQ to make sure we're following best practices, state law, RCWs. And so earlier this year, we started putting together a document essentially to put out to the community to invite all architects to come in, give us their statement of qualifications. And then as a team, which Camille showed earlier, the waterfront team, we went through and we evaluated those submissions. And then we are just in the process of wrapping up interviews and looking to award the next steps to an architectural firm. Let me go into more detail on that, but
yeah, I think that's pretty good. From there, we are just taking an estimate. Whoever the architectural firm is would adjust the planning and design phase, and I imagine it's going to push out a bit. This was our estimation based on previous schedules that we had analyzed.
And just to clarify, this is the roadmap for the one building, not for just so that.
Yes, and in one of the things we heard, not only from Thomas Architecture, who did the master planning, and then the firms that we spoke with in their interviews, is having one very visible project start will be the catalyst. So they're calling this is a catalyst project. The waterfront center and plaza would be a catalyst for development for the entire peninsula.
I have a question on that, but I also am cognizant that I'm chairing. So I wanted to see first whether Commissioner Sanders, Commissioner Tong, do you have anything you wanted to ask? I think this is one of those cases where I'm a new elected, and things that have happened maybe puts me at odds with the decisions made by previous commissioners, unless also I haven't been fully briefed, and it would have been really helpful to have some of the resources in the packet so I knew kind of what you were pulling from before a meeting like today. I think the staff is doing really good work to move this forward, but my concerns come from the following. I share the overall goal. I represent District 1 and the whole county, and share the overall goal of definitely activating redevelopment of our waterfront and increasing public access and amenities, something I campaigned on. The strategy that the architects have recommended to the port of start with a catalyzing facility. They're partly experts and they've recommended that, and I understand that strategy as well. Earlier, the estuarium would have been part of this, and right now the most concrete thing we are saying we're doing to activate redevelopment of the waterfront is moving our port's administrative offices to be like an anchor tenant, right? Like we'll help anchor a revitalization. I have real concerns, and so I want to say big thank you to staff for pushing this to be a strategic briefing today. Camille, you made this happen, and to bringing it before the RFP goes out. I may be alone on this 5-member commission and how I'm feeling. So, but I wanted to say, I don't like the idea of, Camille, you were careful to say, that doesn't mean we have to slow this down, but we're gonna integrate around it. I really don't like the idea of moving forward with waterfront redevelopment based on the only thing really being concrete, being a building that people want in the style of Pacific Northwest without the function of what we're hoping to do. And that's why I've been bringing up the idea of master planning.
Yes.
Kind of, and so when you said master plan, I got kind of super excited, but it was sort of a master plan for that one piece of the property. So what I'd like to understand more, my preference, and of course, no one commissioner makes a call that changes a previous decision just through stating it at a meeting. And right now, that's all I'm doing, is sharing that I would rather see this go on hold, and thinking about how we're integrating with the city of Olympia and others to understand our redevelopment. Going back to the primary vision documents, you really did a great job, Camille, highlighting the things where people want walkability and connectability in the sailing center. And none of that is sort of envisioned at the same time as this very detailed building, which I know was a major goal of yours, Commissioner Harding, to get like a waterfront center going. And so I don't know if we're open to having discussion here, or we could put it on for a future, but I wanted to kind of get that out there since I was making a lot of noises while you were briefing.
So I think I can answer some of your questions, and I think James can as well. Do you want to start with some of the, what we saw in the architectural firms, what they're presenting and their presentations?
Absolutely. And feel free to step in if I start to sidetrack. But I understand your concerns about a building, right, essentially. And I guess I would give a little bit of pushback respectfully. This will house administrative staff and as well as marina. But part of this is to bring in leasable space. So we would call that shell space, where either we have identified a tenant who has expressed interest. That could be community partners like Evergreen State College. It could be a restaurant, it could be retail space. So it will be some administration, some mixed use. But also, I guess, personal example for me, I grew up 20 minutes south of here. Until I worked at the port, I'd never been down Marine Drive Northeast. I'd never been to the Marine. I didn't have a reason to, right? So to be able to also incorporate into this space, not only the building, but on the exterior, the landscape, a place for the public to come and give them a reason to come to the Port of Olympia, and, to drive them onto the Billy Frank Trail down towards North Point. For me, if there was something like that, then it would give me a reason to bring my family here. And so, yes, it is a building, but it also incorporates the community space and gets people to come down to enjoy the waterfront who maybe wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity. And then to digress a little bit back to some of what the architecture firms were saying, and being a catalyst, I guess I'll do this two ways, but in being a catalyst building, what that'll help us do is by giving a destination for people to come down. It also gets other firms, developers, however we went about it, to go, oh, look at that. There are people flocking now to this public space that the port has created, thereby bringing in more development, more economic growth, or businesses, or whatever one of those ended up being. And then, going back to I guess, again, what they were saying is, they all have the destination waterfront plan. And I was very impressed in talking to them that although we are focusing again hyperly on this one building, we are also taking the micro or the macro approach and looking, okay, when we place this building here, it's very important that we consider future development how do we position ourselves that so once we have this, it's already, without having the future designs of these other spaces, it's already considering that. And so that when we do develop it, it flows seamlessly down the rest of the peninsula. So that when we do bring in that additional investment, we've already thought about it, being very careful in planning it, so that it all flows together. It looks seamlessly, I guess, so that it all works together.
James, I hope you don't mind if I add on to that. So as part of our evaluation of firms, firms with experience helping recruit for lease space is part of the equation. It's not just building a building. It's do we have a partner in the architect? Do they have relationships in their subcontractors that have attracting lease tenants to the space? The other piece of that is it's not just the building itself. Outside of the building is the need for landscape architecture. So the hardscaping that you saw on some of the other pictures that I showed here. So when you put in the building, you're not going to want to just, we should not just put in a building with nothing else there. It needs to be, it needs to have the community access. That's part of that. And you're absolutely right about an anchor tenant. We need to be working on that. And in the timeline, we have a market analysis identified here. And that market analysis under funding and feasibility is the money that we have from the Department of Commerce, along with some of our funds that we're contributing, will help conduct that market analysis. And that's going to give us the opportunity to evaluate the types of consumer-facing businesses that can go into the mixed-use space that would be the first floor. And if it's a 3-story building, you can potentially use the top floor could even be more consumer space.
Ask one more
Oh,
follow-up
absolutely.
before, but anyone else? It would be really helpful for me to, and maybe you've already heard this in previous years, and you could point me to a work session, but for Point Ruston or any of these examples, did they follow a similar, the theory of change here is Port builds a property and then you recruit, then you do the market analysis and then you recruit the other investments? Or did people have lined up like the larger vision with housing? And like, I'd love to know, is our theory of change one that went into play in any of those developments, and hear from someone about how it all unfolded? Because I think you've started telling a story and I'm hearing from concerned constituents, and I share that concern. I'm not just relaying it. And so I think as we explore that together and how this has played out in a previous place, consistent with and really making the community thrive, I think that would be so helpful.
Yeah, so I appreciate your questions because, the team that we've assembled asks many of the same questions. Okay, what do we have? What happened? How do we make this work going forward? And I can't speak for the others on the group, but I have a deep sense of fiduciary responsibility. And so as we've looked at this, if you look down in, I think it's mid-April, we start to evaluate market analysis, and that becomes part of the design of the building. We have to start, they can't run.
Building, but I'm interested in
space.
the bigger, these things you show me are not buildings. Or to the extent they started with a building, that's the story I'd like to understand.
Yeah, and that's also another good question, because we have a whole entire real estate division that may want to develop, play out the rest of the master plan for the peninsula, because the master plan for the peninsula is not just the one building and the esplanade in front of it. The master plan was the entire peninsula. Sites have been evaluated.
But I've asked about that and been told there is no master plan for the peninsula. So that's exactly, if you're referencing a master plan for the
Yes.
peninsula, I would like to see that. And I would like to make it evident to the public now, but especially I've been asking for it.
Yeah, so for the public, if there's people on Zoom, it's on our website right now, and you can pick it off our website. And I'll make sure that I email you a copy. I think there might be a copy inside your orientation book as a supplemental piece in there. We didn't cover it inside orientation, but there's the master plan is in there. And so these are all great questions because sites have been identified where there is the opportunity for future development, and then what those could might even be imagined. So they need to be overlaid. So this should not run alone. And then a few years from now, we go, hey, I think we might want to think about the rest of it. They really need to run in tandem, but this is, so today's.
Can I jump in here real quick, Camille?
I know you're both, I'm
Yeah.
revisiting something that you've worked
I'm-
on.
I'm
Well,
sorry
no,
to-
it's not that we worked hard on it, there's just some misinformation, so go ahead, Bob, or Commissioner.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Camille, but I think one of the things that might help explain, as I understood it, was one of the reasons that this Marine Center building came to the forefront ahead of the entire peninsula was the desperate need for a new marina office. So that kind of kicked off the conversation, as you know, as far as I understand it, to help mitigate that. But I do have a question about the number one, the master plan that Thomas Architecture has done. Is that 100% complete, and have all the funds been expended for that? And then the second part of that question is the funding and feasibility. The market analysis, I didn't quite understand where the funding for that comes from.
That would be part of the funding we secured from the Department of Commerce.
The curb grant?
The $250,000 that we got.
250,000.
It was not, the curb grant paid for the master,
Yeah,
the
and it'll be
destination.
done by the architecture firm, right? The
Yes,
market analysis be done by the architecture firm that they are currently in the process of hiring.
yes.
And the scope of it though is market analysis for tenants for that building.
I'm not sure about
That's what I heard from James.
Yes.
And, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, you're good.
I was, sorry to be total newbie here, but one thing that was recommended in the memo that accompanied Camille's materials for the commission was doing a retreat with you all to talk about not just this master plan and really get you guys familiar with what was done, and to the extent we can go also get some information from Bellingham and Vancouver and Point Ruston about their planning processes for comparison. But also how we integrate these plans, the Vision 2050 strategic plans, and then also what Camille and I have talked about. We'd really love to set up action plans, which I heard you guys would really love to see 1-year action plans or 2-year action plans for how we're implementing this. So we can accelerate the timeline for trying to do something like that, understanding you all have super busy schedules, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's whatever direction everyone wants to go. I think it's important for context that Vision 2050 was a massive public
Yes.
input project. Destination Waterfront rolled up under Vision 2050 to gather feedback on one particular thing that came out of Vision 2050, which essentially was a community master planning effort around the waterfront. I actually voted against this building because I did not support administration being the driving force. So I'm not just like woohoo. I had concerns about that as well, but I supported the body of the commission in moving forward for all of the reasons that everyone's talked about, as far as activating these public access amenities. We're not getting small boat access or more trails without some sort of construction happening. So kicking off this building, and we have this $250,000 allocation for planning, which our marina office is derelict. Like, it's actually not a good working environment. That was a huge part, as Commissioner Ayala mentioned. And they also have more market opportunities if they had additional space available. I think within the planning process, we can scope these additional tenants, and there's starts and stops in this process. If we get to a certain stage in planning and it's gonna be $50 million and we all don't wanna do it, then we move, correct?
That's right.
So we are at the planning, what the commission approved last year was moving forward with administration, estuarium, marina office, activating these public amenities. And so there has been a change with the
Yes.
estuarium. That question needs to be answered in this scoping process. And I am sure that it will be, so that we can then make an educated decision on how to proceed. But I still support moving forward with this part of the process so that we can have, it's been 40 years that this has been started and stopped and started and stopped because there hasn't been something that has been the catalyst project. So I don't think it's that there hasn't been master planning efforts. There have been vast amounts of master planning efforts over the course of time, some of them pretty recent. Doesn't mean they can't be updated, but that's significant hundreds of thousands of dollars and community feedback time that I think we need to listen to. Because otherwise we're reinventing the wheel, so. But I share your, I don't wanna build something just to build something. I want to intentionally build something that activates on what the community has told us that they want to see there, which is a mix of things. Which I think that this building could very well achieve.
If I could jump in there just real quick too on that, I think now because of the changes down there, this market analysis is more important than ever, because I think, you know, having the estuarium down there was a quantifiable tenant in that space that we knew was going to drive traffic to the peninsula and be a very good public amenity. So now without the estuarium, I think that market analysis is going to have to help us identify what it is that's going to be beneficial to the community and drive traffic.
I heartily endorse what you just said, Commissioner Ryle. So one that leads me to wonder is, how can we sort of springboard from this really good kind of beginning of catching up with where things have been to sort of the shared with our public visioning of kind of like how this fits into kind of an evolution in the future. You're the one who'd think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, so I'm glad you brought that up. So we need to start communication planning, and we need to be working with our interlocal partners, community, business partnerships. This isn't just building a building, there's the whole public component of that. And as we evaluate these architectural firms, that's part of the work and part of their experience that they have. So architectural firms have experience in working with commissions and with the public and making sure that we create, we share the vision and what it could look like for the community, and we can create spaces to get feedback from the community along the way. This should not be just done, you know, without the public knowing we're doing it. We need to move forward to have something to share with them though.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about our interlocal partners, who they are and how they're being convened, you know, and in what setting or?
We don't have any yet. That's what we need to establish.
I can add something to that. There was discussions happening previous to the change in staff about a workforce training center with LOT, City of Olympia, Port of Olympia, things like that that have gotten dropped off based on our staff turnover and not participating, that being one of many projects that could be picked back up as a potential tenant, a potential, like, I think that we have to, it's a chicken egg thing a little bit, like, we have to actually have some sort of a plan of, there's this many square feet projected, and it's gonna cost this much, so that then you can connect the dots with some of the interlocal partners.
And a few slides back, I mentioned that one of our challenges was confidence from our interlocal relationships. And having an executive director now is positions us well so we can start creating interlocal, you know, partnerships. Up until this point, you know, they're like, well, when are you getting a new executive director? I mean, that's been the question. And, you know, to Rudy's credit, he was getting ready to retire and wasn't in a position where he could launch a number of interlocal agreements. So so we're at a really good position now where all of the proper planning should be taking place. We should start the visioning with our community and keeping you briefed along the way. I mean, I've just picked out some dates that like every 8 weeks we're briefing you. You know, I don't know if that's appropriate, the dates that I picked there, but the idea is that we'll keep the commission updated along the way, and there'll be opportunity to share with you the direction of the project.
I can add something as well, Camille.
Please do.
You know, speaking of community partners, you know, we've talked a little bit about the mixed use space, which could be lease space for different variety of people. However, part of that also includes, you know, event space. So event space, for example, this room, right? And if we have a location over on the waterfront area, we can invite partners like I mentioned earlier, Evergreen State College can come and host classes maybe out of our space, and you know, some of the other community partners, if they have a space that they can come to, then maybe some of those partners who aren't necessarily a tenant anchor lease, you know, can rent out our building for their events. You know, that could be anything from private institutions like colleges, or public institutions like colleges, or you know, like weddings or birthdays, you know, whatever that space could be. But having that a reimagined space where we can invite the community in will also help to foster those community partnerships. Whereas now it is a bit more of a struggle to have those partnerships. But once we have that space for them, I think that'll also help grow some of those partnerships.
So the architectural firms that we interviewed, they have experience working with municipalities who have spaces and using them, designing them in a way that can become a community amenity. So without prompting them, you know, could you do this? They're recommending that based on their experience with other organizations. And also some of our evaluation is office space planning. How can we reduce our footprint so that we, as a port administrative office, can we adapt our space so that it's flexible? Meaning that maybe we don't need to take up as large a footprint as maybe we do today. Do we have hybrid workstations? Do people partially work from home? Do they partially work in the office? So making sure that our partners, whoever those architectural firms are, have experience in that and can help make recommendations for us that are smart and will take us into the future.
Thank you, Camille. We're at 5:32. I'd like to go no more than 5 more minutes, if that's okay with everybody. And I do have 2 questions, but first, is there anyone, okay, or comments to kind of start addressing some of my concerns? One, can we figure out, it sounds like there's been so much public engagement in one way. Back in 2017, when we did the 2050 vision, which people have told me through the campaign and through recently, you know, wow, so much of it is still valuable and on steps, but then there's like these fits and starts where we lose the engagement, right? Is there a way we can bring this back and have an opportunity for public input in the near future, kind of about the direction where we're going, especially without the SURAM, or think in a way, what would be a constructive place for some input would be valuable to me. And second, whether we could use an RFI or whether the architect can be asked to consider a request for information as we're looking at these public partnerships and what are the needs, the things people are interested in seeing as part of their shared public space at the waterfront. When you're talking about things like community colleges or different, those sorts of partners that are quasi-governmental themselves or governmental, I'd be interested to see any evidence that yes, you know, here's something that we're looking for that opportunity downtown. An RFI, I think, is something different than applying to say, I'm gonna do something and so I'd encourage staff to consider that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've, you know, without even asking people, we've had, I know at least one educational facility tell us that they're interested in space here. And just in the idea that that might be an opportunity. So I'm hopeful that we can come back in the coming weeks and we can bring more information to you. And in the interim, I'll certainly make sure that I'll have links to the master plan from Thomas Architecture for sure.
Thank you. Well, then with that, Commissioner Rudolph, not Commissioner, Director Rudolph is not Director
No,
Rudolph
he went
anymore.
home. He went home early today. He's here through Thursday, then he'll start some vacationing, but he's trying to sort of fade away. So that's really.
And he shepherded a really strong management team. And so we're so happy to have you here. Director Alex Smith. And just a note, if there are any viewers, that the town hall that you've agreed to help conduct is next Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Here? No, right
Here.
Yes, we're here. And hopefully we'll get that up on our website soon, and it's all across different media outlets, but so few of us access each outlet nowadays, that getting it up on the website will be great. Thank you, everyone. This meeting, are we at it? Shall be adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.